Welcome to this session in which we are going to reflect on the visions, voices, and practices from Zapatistas. Years ago, Immanuel Wallerstein and Noam Chomsky said that the Zapatista movement was the political initiative that was the most important and significant in the world. Many of us believe that it is still and more than ever. In the next 2 hours, we will see why. For this session, we have in the first place Jorge Santiago, who speaks to us today from Chiapas, very close from the Zapatista region. He has been a member, he still is a member of the governing board of the Center for Human Rights, Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, which in Chiapas has had a very, very important role in all these years. He is also a member of the governing board of Coreco and DESMI, which are two organizations that have been very close to the organizations in Chiapas for several decades already. He wrote a very interesting book called Solidarity, Political Economy. Welcome, Jorge. I give you the floor.
Me falta todavía
entender bien cómo. There are still some technical aspects that I still have to understand. I was listening very well to Gilberto, and I want to be with you. I wanted to be present earlier, but I didn't know how to say what I want to say at the beginning. And also I wanted to participate as the first, because a concern that I have had recently. I have to say that being in Chiapas and participating in processes since I was very young, I have been following these struggles of the peoples and their organization in different ways, especially the EZLN. And now I have tried to follow until this now to determine the strategy that the ELN had. It's a strategy of war without war. This struggle of the people is a collective vocation. It's invincible. It's the fruit of the conscience, and it can be placed as a vanguard of changes. And you can convert it into something that is collective and daily, in day-to-day life. The strength and the energy of these peoples come from their spirit, the strength of their spirit. And this is why now they are placing themselves with the possibility of a global dialogue. And this gives them the capacity to triumph in the search. And this is what they are linked to the territory and conscience, the two bases of their organizational capacity are being owners of the territory and having a conscience that allow them to remain firm. And the EZ has to resolve a question: how to reach the strategic objectives, how to triumph without war. How can we be strong, nimble, and have power how can we be facing the enemy without destroying him, and rather converting him in a force for good? So how to become permanently strategic? And one of the answers is to not lie, to not create fantasies, and to see reality as it is. The capacity to be in reality in all its senses, all its meanings, and at no time to and to resist these power structures, the bosses, the patriarchy, the threats, and the histories of aggression, to not fall in any traps, and above all, go forward despite everything and win the battle. Before the progress of the strategy of death is we have to find the road of life. And this is the vision of triumph of the Zapatistas. And at the same time, in this pandemic, it has given them the possibility of finding a solution to the persecution and the military encirclement, which is there to destroy the possibility of the autonomous people and their capacity to decide for themselves how they will develop themselves, and the fact that they are the owners of a territory, and that their life depends on their relation with this territory. So the pandemic itself, with the capacity to protect themselves, the capacity to develop permanent relations, allow them to find a solution. And this solution has given them the idea of not going the military confrontation way, but to fight for life. The confrontation is a reality because of the aggressions of the different military and police forces and paramilitaries. There is a confrontation from the state militarization in order to exercise control over all the relations and the possibility of establishing infiltrations of the movement, and to create in the movements aggressions and create conditions so that the Zapatista army would answer in a violent way. But they haven't succeeded. The Zapatistas have found this strategy, which is an option for life, and a declaration to find their fundamental objective, the life of all, as one of the fundamental objectives in their struggle. So when we found this, and when we see this declaration for life, we see that the EZ has succeeded in removing itself from the military confrontation, and has been able to strengthen its resistance beyond all the destruction, and in the sense of developing life. And it's part of a proposal that can be developed with a vision of reality against militarization, and despite this militarization that is encircling them. and and the, and the permanent sign of the many situation now is the collapse, and the state cannot respond because it doesn't have the capacity and the confidence, and the people in a certain way don't have the possibility of consolidating themselves. So the only way out is the construction of life, the respect of the territory, and the search for relations and dialogue, finding dialogue in which we are all equal, and towards the construction of these relations that place us at the same level and destroy all possibilities of domination and all possibilities of placing oneself as one towards the other as enemies, and to establish relations, to learn together, to move forward together, and to understand that some points are shared, and these common points can lead us to a different life. And this different life is the building of a dream in which life reemerges with a participation. And again, we have the capacity to see the future, the past, and the future in a way that we have a horizon. And this horizon that we see as a horizon of life has been called the option for life, fighting for life. So, to summarize this last part, I would say that the fundamental point here in this option for life, there are several points. One, that the suffering of the earth, and we know the systems that are causing this suffering. We know that we cannot reform this system, but rather have to change it. And we are sure that the struggle for the humanity is a world struggle. We are convinced that there are many worlds that are living and are struggling, and any pretension of homogenization and dominance is false, and we have to respect differences and the understanding of that we don't want to impose our vision and objectives. This won't let us go forward, but rather to look at the other who is different and has the same vocation of liberty and justice. So these points can lead us to this possibility of uniting ourselves, all these movements in which the women have a fundamental role, and in which peoples, because of their capacity and long ancestral capacity, not just in the sense of simply maintaining resistance, but to have proposals to dialogue with the world in its diversity and create conditions to strengthen a strategy that involves the defense of life for everyone, women and men. So, because of the time, I believe I will stop now. I didn't read everything I wanted to share with you, but would be my contribution. Thank you very much. Very excellent. It was 13 minutes and a half. Very good.
Start then with Gilberto Lopez y Rivas, who is a professor and researcher at the National Institute of Anthropology and History in the state of Morelos. He writes in La Jornada, which is the most important newspaper in Mexico currently, and he has adhered to the sixth declaration of the Lacandona jungle. He is a member of the Paso Doble collective of support to the National Indigenous Congress and the Indigenous Council of Government of the Zapatista army. He was advisor to the for the Zapatistas in their negotiations with the government, and he has been very close to the movement from the first day. Go ahead, Gilberto. Good night, good evening, good morning. Thank you, everybody. All members of the teams, Jade, Kinchi, all of you who are making this communication possible. The national context in which the military political movement of national liberation forces emerges in August 6, 1969, from which the EZLN, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, would emerge, founded on November 17th in 1983, was the regime of the state party that lasted for several decades, profoundly anti-democratic and repressive of the railroad movement of the 67, the teachers movement in the 60s, the doctors movement also in the 60s, and also responsible of the state crimes and crimes against humanity of October 1968 and 10th July 1971. This state violence and the conditions of repression for the majorities lead us to replace all the struggles to replace this daily base to base. It is important to mention the Cuban Revolution in 1959, which provoked the formation of movements that take on the armed struggle from the 60s until the end of the 80s, with the triumph of the Sandinistas on July 19, 1979. For our generation, the action of the young Martianos, led by Fidel Castro, showed that patriotism, love for the cause of the people, and a revolutionary ethics cannot be demonstrated with words. It was therefore necessary to take decisive actions and attack on the dictatorial state when the peaceful paths to solve the huge social, economic, and political problems are closed. The EZLN's insurrection or uprising started on January 1st, 1994, and the peace dialogue with the Mexican federal government, which started on February 20th of that same year, evolved in uneven stages until its suspension in the second half of 1996, represent unprecedented processes in the history of revolutionary armed conflicts in Latin America. The specificity lies in the mostly indigenous composition of the Mayan Zapatista grouping, which took up arms on the basis of the 39th article of the Mexican Constitution, which establishes that national sovereignty resides essentially and originally in the people. All public power stems from the people and is instituted for their benefit. The people have at all times the inalienable right to alter or modify the form of their government. Thus, despite the fact that the National Liberation Forces holds the political, ideological, and organizational characteristics of national liberation, the indigenous context in Chiapas, in which the initial mestizo and urban group was implanted, radically modified the forms and contents of the rebellion. The communities even voted on the relevance of the war against the government and the date for the beginning of hostilities and the occupation of at least 7 municipal capitals, precisely on the day in which the free trade agreement agreed upon by Mexico, the US, and Canada came into effect. The former insurgent sub-commander Marcos, now Galeano, maintained that the revolutionary mestizos who arrived at the Lacandona jungle in the first half of the 80s were defeated by the communities, who appropriated the insurgent project and transformed it. The EZLN's own military operations did not follow the classic patterns of Latin American guerrillas and were more similar to the indigenous uprising of colonial and independence times, with a massive and sudden seizures of cities, centers of despotic and racist power by armies of insurgent Indians. These displacements of thousands of men and women towards the centers of the power gives the EZLN an imprint that other national liberation movements do not have. From the moment the indigenous rebellion broke out, the government of Carlos Salinas de Gortari resorted to the use of force, including aerial bombing, and tried in the ideological field to project in the national and international media the image of a local conflict. Until then, the official policy towards indigenous peoples was merely welfare-oriented, aimed at avoiding social conflicts more than at resolving the causes of misery, exploitation, and abandonment of the indigenous peoples. The so-called indigenism was the policy of the Mexican state, a combination of paternalism and clientelism, co-optation, and repression, never focusing on the needs and actions of the indigenous peoples themselves. From the first days following the uprising, the EZLN aroused the sympathy of broader popular sectors of Mexican society and others in the international arena, which took to the streets to demand an end to the government repression and dialogue, while some intellectuals supporting Salinas sought to discredit the political military organization. The anthropologist Arturo Warman said that the uprising was not a movement of the poor, I quote, but the manipulation of poverty. It is not an indigenous movement. It is a political military project implanted among the Indians, but without representing them. There are many Indians, I suppose the majority among the soldiers, so-called soldiers of what is called the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, who have grievances that could explain their decision. But many, very many more, are on the margin. This is the opinion of the anthropologist, are on the margin or against the military uprising. We must not be confused. It is not the voice of the Indians. It is simply that some of them are present like all the expressions of national life. This hypothesis about the exteriority or of the insurrection and the everlasting character of the indigenous as a subject manipulated by outside forces was used by Salinas, the Mexican army, and intelligence services, and by some media analysts to look for the origin of the rebellion in Central American guerrillas, foreign agitators, and mestizo revolutionaries. The poet Octavio Paz, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, expressed his concern about the repercussions of the rebellion on the stock exchange and the deterioration of Mexico's international image, while a massacre of indigenous peoples was taking place in the Ocosingo market. Beyond the diverse reactions of the Mexican intelligentsia to the EZLN rebellion in the immediate aftermath of its public emergence, what is true is that a consensus began to emerge in Mexican society. The fundamental demands of the Zapatistas expressed the social condition of millions of indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. From then on, the conflict was defined as a long-term national problem that touched upon the essence of the relations between the Mexican state and the peoples that make up the nation, including the poor and the exploited mestizo people. Thus, on January the 1st, 1994, an insurgent army took as its symbolic image the agrarian caudillo of the Mexican Revolution, Emiliano Zapata, and showed that other Mexico of deep contradictions and social polarizations that was far from the first world to which Salinas promised to arrive through structural reform, such as the privatization of communal lands eliminating Article 27 of the Constitution, another of the causes that triggered the uprising. The Zapatistas managed to make known a Mexico that was very different from the transnational commercial firms, different from that Mexico conceived by the banking and financial elites, far from the political elites. The EZLN emerged from the other Mexico, the one of those from below, the one that entered modernity, surviving, resisting, defending rights, lands, territories, sovereignties, and life itself. The news that an insurgent army declaring war on the Mexican army quickly spread throughout the world's media, causing sympathy and accompaniment of groups of activists who began to arrive in Chiapas. The Zapatista movement became a milestone of universal transcendence, channeling a new world of utopia construction at a time when the paradigms of real socialism were disappearing along with the Soviet Union. Thus, there was no choice but to acknowledge the genuine indigenous origin of this rebellion. The folkloric image of the Indian, which condemned him to museum petrification, tourist merchandise, and the alleged innate inability to raise national demands and international alliances was overturned, and he suddenly appeared, and they suddenly appeared as a social and political actor that could not be ignored. It was the revelation of a denied identity, always present in the historical confirmation and in the current reality of the Mexican nation, coming from the otherness which had been secularly belittled. An undeniable political merit of the EZLN is that it has initiated a broad and complex citizen and sectorial convergence, both in Mexico and internationally, aimed at understanding this indigenous reality and opening a peace dialogue to a broad and genuine representation of civil society. This is a difference with respect to the peace dialogues that take place in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Colombia, as well as the speed with which negotiations were initiated. The pressure exerted from the beginning of the conflict by civil society through massive demonstrations against the massacres of indigenous peoples for peace and a negotiated solution in various cities, but mainly in the capital of the Republic, as well as the reaction of numerous political organizations, unions, churches, and recognized intellectuals, forced a unilateral ceasefire by the federal army, the appointment of a peace commissioner, and the reluctant acceptance of the mediation of Bishop Samuel Ruiz. Thus, from February 22nd to March the 2nd, 1994, the cathedral dialogue took place in San Cristobal de las Casas, which was attended by the military, the Red Cross, and members of 287 non-governmental organizations, as well as hundreds of national and foreign journalists. The assassination of Luis Donald Colosio, a candidate for the for presidency, on March 23rd, 1994, caused the first of several crises in the peace process and the return of the EZLN command to its mountain positions. The second crisis was again provoked by the federal government, now headed by Cedillo, who on February 9th, 1995, ordered the entry of the army into the zone controlled by the Zapatistas in an unsuccessful attempt to capture the EZLN General Command. During those days, the security forces apprehended 20 presumed Zapatistas, some of them members of the National Liberation Forces, and released the police file of Subcomandante Marcos. These crises were favorably resolved, not only due to the real commitment of the Zapatistas to attempt a peaceful and negotiated solution to the conflict, but also due to the formation of two political actors. First, the National Intermediation Commission, the CONAI, headed by Bishop Samuel Ruiz, and made up of Chiapas and national personalities from the civil society. The other instance, the Commission for Concord and Pacification, COCOPA, was created by the Law for Dialogue, Conciliation, and Dignified Peace in Chiapas, March 11, 1995, and integrated by federal representatives and senators of the Congress of the Union, a two-chamber body of which I was part of for 3 years in my capacity as a federal representative, showed at key moments its commitment to the peace process beyond the interest of the respective political parties. When I was the acting president of COCOPA, I filed a complaint with the Attorney General's office regarding the existence of paramilitary groups. These groups continue to exist to this day. Likewise, the existence of this law, enacted by the legislative power of the Federation, made it possible to establish the normativity of the dialogue and the explicit recognition of its 4 actors, the EZLN, the federal government, the CONAI, and COCOPA. With this legal framework and the presence of these actors, 17 sessions took place from April 20th, 1995 to August 12th, 1996, resulting in the 17 sessions, resulting in the signings of the so-called San Andres Agreements on Indigenous Rights and Culture on February 16th of that year. Up to here, the context, the events, and the actors of the dialogue. Now we will look at the meanings of this dialogue if I have time to explain it. It has been 15 minutes, so I'll just mention them. First, Zapatismo imposed the indigenous issue in the national debate and forced the Mexican state to negotiate the San Andres Agreements on Indigenous Rights and Culture. 2, in the San Andres dialogue, Zapatistas handed over dialogue with the federal government to the civil society and to representatives of indigenous peoples. 3, the dialogue process was a university on how to do politics based on collective participation and without the mediation of competitive individualism or corporate interests. 4th, from the moment the EZLN burst into the national scene, the days of indigenism were numbered. That dialogue was called as the funeral of indigenism. 5, in the Roundtable on Indigenous Rights and Cultures, all the documents that resulted in the San Andres Agreements, arising from the various phases of the dialogue, were the subject of heated and rich discussions to reach consensus, which was the only condition of the Zapatista leadership to their advisors and guests. 6, the proposal for indigenous autonomies that was agreed upon in San Andres is based on long-term perspective aimed at seeking a profound reform of the state and society that modifies the very essence of the social pact. 7, if we take as a current criterion to define the left as the political force that builds popular power against capitalism without monopolizing representation or subtracting protagonism from the different socio-ethnic sectors, the EZ has been throughout these more than 25 years an organization extremely congruent with one of its most cherished principles: everything for everyone, nothing for us. 8, during all these years of non-compliance of the San Andres Agreements, the EZ has shown an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and innovation without throwing overboard any principle and contributing to crucial issues. During all these years, the EZ has been the critical consciousness facing the state and society. And I finish saying that new caracoles appear last year. Of the 5 that we have, now we have 12 that we had, now we have 12 in a long-term process of search with thousands of community assemblies. And this is a transformation of revolutionary outreach where Mayan Zapatistas are summoning us with their example. So let there be more new caracoles and more autonomous Zapatista rebel municipalities from the bottom and from the left, anti-capitalist and anti-patriarchal, to make possible in our realities that concrete utopia built by the Zapatista brothers and sisters.
And now we will ask Alejandra Jiménez to make her presentation. Alejandra Jiménez has played an important role in the National Indigenous Congress. She has been one of its most important voices, and she has played an important role in key moments. And she the regional coordinator of solidarity actions in the defense of territories in Veracruz. Right now, she's in Oaxaca, where she is working with indigenous peoples of Oaxaca. Welcome, Alejandra. You have the floor. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to share this panel with you and to be with this public from the other end of the world. And it's really moving for me to be able to share with you what is happening in the global south with the indigenous people. We have indigenous people, we have been resisting for centuries. I would like to share with you a presentation that I did because I think that an important part of the movement, of the Zapatista movement, is all the beautiful drawings that it has generated, which shows the diversity of that we have been talking about since the beginning, the diversity of the earth, its different colors. And in this presentation, I tried to show some of the very numerous images that are available in the web. And these are images, drawings that have been published in our activities. So I'm going to talk a bit about the National Indigenous Congress, how it was created. As Gustavo said, I am part of this National Indigenous Congress from Tetonacapa. The National Indigenous Congress was founded after a call by the EZLN in 1994. So we started a very interesting dialogue with other indigenous peoples and other movements and other communities in resistance. And there was a call for this dialogue. In 1996, in October of 1996, this space was created, which is the Indigenous National Congress. We say that it's the home, the house of the indigenous people, a space where we can reflect and uh, develop solidarity, and in which we can share our resistance and support each other and strengthen our organizations and our ways of representing ourselves and organizing ourselves. And for the easy, this is vital, this strengthening of indigenous peoples and revival of the indigenous people. So we have a network uh, and we have general meetings. In this space of the National Indigenous Congress, there are over 90 indigenous people in our country with over 60 languages. In some cases, there are a few people that speak the languages, but the languages are still uh, alive. And there are 44 languages that indigenous peoples that speak their own language that are part of our Congress. So we have we made the Zapatista demands our own for education, security, justice, spirituality. So there's education, autonomy, self-defense, and also self-government.
No ha pasado
So I,
todavía.
Ok. ¿Ahora?
No, ya, ahora sí, ahora sí.
Okay. Bueno, pues, y en este contexto.
So in this context, we have to recognize that during this time of resistance, where we have gone over more than 5 centuries of domination and exploitation, and we do not forget our history. Our history is part of our rebellion and our resistance. And this is what makes us struggle for autonomy. And we recognize as our constitution the agreements, the San Andres agreements, which is the only way that we can continue as native peoples. And this is a very important point for the Congress, the recognition, the acknowledgement of these agreements. I'm going to try to move on to the next slide. And other elements that are very important within the National Indigenous Congress are the 7 principles, which are also the principles of the EZLN, which are to lead by obeying. And here are the 7 principles: to serve and not serve oneself, to represent and not replace. These have to do with our daily being as indigenous peoples, and they are part of the Congress. To construct and not to destruct, to obey and not to lead. We were looking at the 7 Zapatista principles. And also what is very important for us, when we started to meet in 1998, acknowledging and recognizing as something that is very important the integral reconstitution of our being native people's autonomy, and recognize ourselves as a fundamental assembly organ. In 2001, after the government betrays these attempts for dialogue and to create agreements that would allow us recognition as native peoples, we understand something that is basic. With the government, we cannot have a dialogue. We have to build from below. Among us, the native peoples, we are going to define the future that we want, and that we cannot be or live at the expense of the government. That is when we have the March for Indigenous Dignity, the March for the Colors of the Earth, and we understand that we have to create dialogue at the bottom, not upwards, and that our struggle is obviously to the left and is anti-capitalist and is anti-patriarchal. In the 4th National Indigenous Congress, which is in 2006, with the 6th Declaration of the Lacandona Jungle of 2005, we also established that we have to reach the last consequences in the defense of our territories and autonomy and resistance. We recognize ourselves as mirrors of all of those that have been subject, that have been dominated, those that have been exploited. We recognize ourselves in the pain of others. And in this being a mirror to that pain, we also recognize that we have to fight for all these pains and these injustices that other peoples are living, that are in America, but not only in the American continent, but in other territories as well. We also recognize not only the struggle of native peoples, but also of urban spaces, of the different sexual diversities that are recognized, that are not so recognized in many movements, these sexual diversities. And we recognize that from our pain comes our being mad, and our rebellion, and from the rebellion stems the freedom of the peoples of the world. And finally, I'm going to move into the last thing that I want to mention is that in 2016, within the framework of the 20th anniversary of our emergence as National Indigenous Congress, and responding to the suggestion of the EZLN of forming the Indigenous Government Council, we took this to our assemblies, this idea of forming the Indigenous government, which from the beginning was mentioned as a space of representation for the Indigenous peoples, where a woman and a man would participate on equal terms to integrate this council, this Indigenous Government Council, and this council would be represented by spokespeople, which were finally defined. They should be whether a woman, we defined that a woman should take the word, should be the spokesperson. This was very important for us. This really moved us. It was a big thing for us, and it really made us question ourselves, because from the figure of a spokesperson, we also thought about the initiative that this spokesperson compete in the 2017 elections that we had in Mexico. And this generated a series of mobilizations where it was clear that we were not interested in power. What we were interested in was to continue fighting for life from all the spaces. As we said before, our struggle had to reach the last consequences, and being coherent and consistent with this is that we accepted in the 2016 assembly in December is that we would initiate this Indigenous Government Council with the spokesperson Marichuy, who we did a huge recollection, a gathering of signatures, so she could be an independent candidate for the Indigenous peoples, which was a huge mobilization all over the country, where again, we went back to getting close to the movements at the bottom, to the native peoples, to the pain and the most recent offenses, to the most recent domination that continues to reproduce itself, even though there has been a change in government now. And that's why when we know, that's how we understand that with the political parties, there is actually no real change. It's only through our organization that we are going to achieve change. We have achieved many changes. Some of these have to do with the organization that has been constructed and built with the different resistances, the urban ones, in academics, with women, in different spaces. We have been able to weave alliances and to construct another type of politics, a politics that stems from these 7 principles that are part of the EZLN, and to strengthen our resistance and our rebellions, putting life at the center of things. And in this context, with all of this that we are living, that has to do with COVID, it's really a demonstration of what the EZLN has been telling us, and also what we have been saying in the Indigenous Congress. We are in the middle of the storm, and the storm is going to take us all if we do not organize ourselves, if we do not understand that we are not going to achieve anything on an individual level, that this is a collective struggle. It's a global issue. The struggle for life is an issue that attains us all, and that the only way to face it is united and organized. And so in October of last year, the EZLN summoned us to go out to other continents so as to weave alliances with people who are struggling in other parts of the world. It's not only in Mexico that we are living the huge violence which is a result of capitalism, of neoliberal and patriarchal capitalism. In these moments where we are weaving this network of alliances that are going to receive the Zapatistas, but also women from the National Indigenous Congress. It's a delegation formed by women because we believe that it is us women who are the cure to this patriarchal, male chauvinistic, machista, neoliberal capitalist system. And that weaving with other women, we are going to be able to find new answers, new responses that are not only new, but they also have to do with being able to listen to the voices of our grandmothers who have been silenced over centuries. And many times that silenced voice has left a mark on us as women that have allowed us to continue here. So on August 13th, 2021, we hope to be in Spain, 500 years of resistance. We hope to recognize then that beyond that, we are resisting peoples all over the world. And on the other hand, just two more things I want to mention is that aggressions towards indigenous people and indigenous communities have continued from December 2018, when the new government, the new federal government that is allegedly leftist, the aggressions towards indigenous people have grown, have increased brutally. Militarization and the presence of this new National Guard that aims to preserve the capital, the interests of capital in alliance with the state. So I want to emphasize that it is not with the state, it is not with this legal system that we are going to build and construct the justice. And finally, the role of women. As I mentioned, this delegation that is going to go to Europe, going to Spain, is mainly integrated by women, composed of women. Why? Because the first uprising of the EZLN was in March 1993. It was led by Zapatista women. And the first document that we could say that attests to the EZLN is the revolutionary law of Zapatista women. So this speaks of the centrality of women within the Zapatista movement and also the centrality of women within the Indigenous National Congress, and it's very clear in the Indigenous Government Council. It's the voice of a woman who gives the voice to all our indigenous movements. So I'm going to close here. I know that my comrades are going to speak about this same topic. So I'll close here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alejandra. This is a very strong voice. Your strong voice was very much needed in this panel, and we received it very much on time to hear this voice of women, which is one of the key voices in the whole Zapatista movement. Now I'm going to give the floor to David Barkin, who's going to speak from Morelia, Michoacán, which is another area of Mexico. He's a professor and researcher in the Autonomous University, Metropolitan Autonomous University. We can say many things, but today, basically, he is concentrated on his work, on his activism, focused on radical ecological economy. He also works on the revolutionary community subject. And these are the key issues which he is thinking about today. Go ahead, David. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, a huge pleasure for me to be here today. I want to congratulate and to thank the extraordinary efforts and capacities of the Lingnan University to gather us at this moment, at this time. This moment, this time is particularly important. It is important because we are doing it within the big framework, the large framework of the World Social Forum. We have to understand that the Zapatistas constitute a mechanism of construction of a new form, a new way of globalization, a form of globalization that stems from the bottom. It is the Zapatista army, but the Zapatista movement is really challenging the model of neoliberal globalization. And at this moment, where at the beginning of this year, they have published the latest of the 6 communications establishing their trip all over the world, it is extraordinarily important to see the very determined effort to find in their travels, in the travels that they want to do from the mid-2021 to reach at least 64 countries, to facilitate the internationalization of the struggles of these groups in these countries. I counted in the declaration of January 1st that there were at least 200 organizations that are considering joining an alternative global network, overcoming the individual struggles and their limitations in order to create a global alliance of the revolutionary community subject, a subject that is all over the world and that poses a very different revolution. A revolution that is very different from the Marxist proletariat revolution, because today it involves forging new models of society, going beyond resistances against neoliberal oppression, against the integration, the neoliberal integration process, which is subject to the discipline of the global market, and creating new systems of autonomy, local processes of self-government to control and care for their territories and to increase their level of lives or their livelihoods. In this sense, I want to emphasize something that Alejandra has just mentioned in the historic context that Gilberto mentioned at the beginning with his presentation, and it is that this emergence of Mexico, it is important to understand it within the long history that Gilberto told us about, where Zapatistas are not an isolated element. They are creating at this moment a network, a national system of solidarity for mutual support within Mexico, which is transforming, which is becoming a titanic effort to build on an international level. What is happening in Mexico that gives them this strength? Alejandra mentioned and emphasized that we are discussing today not only the EZLN, but this is also part of a structure of the National Indigenous Congress and the Indigenous Government Council in which Alejandra participates. And it's very, very important what we have in Mexico at this time. As mentioned by Alejandra, there are some groups that speak 68 languages. There are about 25 million people who have indigenous ancestry, and they are demanding in relation to 1/3 of the national territory. They are involved in struggles against projects that are called death projects that have to do with mining. Even, and this is incredible, renewable energies in our country are projects that are maybe good for the environment, but they are damaging, they are destroying, they are disorganizing communities and taking away the possibility of using in a sensitive way, in a sensible way, both in the production of these energies and in relation to products for life. And currently, the problem is even worse as a result of a series of infrastructure projects, massive infrastructure projects that are threatening to disarticulate communities all over the southeast of our country. But as a consequence of this, throughout the country and all over the country, there are new alliances between peoples, not only indigenous peoples, but also with peasants and with the solidary social economy, as we will hear about with Claudia Caballero in a while. But this effort of constructing new alliances is not an effort for the power. It's not an initiative for power, but it's an initiative to build new social institutions to protect and to enrich the country. At this moment, it is extraordinary. So building these new structures, it is the collaboration of the Zapatista army with the National Congress and the Indigenous Council entails a new effort of rebuilding the vision of an alternative society in our country.
A fines de enero,
But at this time, at the end of January, we are seeing that their vision is not to limit ourselves to Mexico. Their vision is to promote through its presence in Spain and in different other countries of Europe, and they are proposing to travel to Asia and Africa to create and promote solidarity mechanisms that would use the energy of all these organizations in the development of a new way of answering to the challenges of international globalization, to challenge the internationalization of the market through the reinforcement of local autonomous structures, and to insist in local control and production for life instead of the collaboration in death projects. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you my thoughts. Thank you very much, David. Your comments were very efficient. And now we will listen to Mariana Mora from the Social Anthropology Research Center, and who is also part of the Decolonial Feminist Network. And she has written a study on indigenous autonomy. Welcome, Mariana. Go ahead. Thank you very much, Gustavo. It's a pleasure to be with you, with all of you. Good evening to, or good day, or good afternoon to everyone. When I was invited to make a presentation here, I was thinking in the meaning of the Mexicans. What is the meaning of us talking to other countries of the world 27 years after the insurrection of the Zapatistas? And it's a reflection of strong movements that can talk to other generations and to other historical conditions beyond the historical conditions that saw them develop. And this is something that I would like to share with you. There are reflections in this current situation of the pandemic, and also, and to add to what Alejandra and Jorge said regarding the meaning of a meeting that is focused above all on life, and why this movement transcends the historical moment of the start of the free trade agreement of North America in 1994, and the struggle against neoliberal policies of the Mexican state. And what is the Zapatismo is saying now, today, in this pandemic, and how they are challenging the states. These are the ideas I would like to share with you. I teach on the social movements, and I talk about historical conditions and the movements that appear as an answer or a reaction to these problems. And one of the beauties of Zapatismo is that they announce historical conditions that we didn't even realize when we are from different generations here. We were against a state party that Gilberto, which had been in the power for 7 decades, which had created the perfect dictatorships. And we were against the privatization of all the social programs. And we didn't imagine the type of violence that would be launched in the country through the war against drug trafficking, which has destroyed thousands of lives, and also the violence against women. And we didn't imagine all these things and the pandemic. And from the beginning, and this is something that Jorge said, Zapatismo is focused on developing on life, and creating a space for life. And this way of challenging us, whether we are indigenous or mestizo or Afro Mexican, when this war against the drug trafficking started, the political action of the people at the grassroots is to protect life, because they are killing us. So even though it was an initiative of the Zapatista army, there was something else that was relevant regarding feminicide, the policies, the extractivist policies, and their narco traffic, this destruction of the life of the territories, of nature, and of human beings. So even so we were imagining the situation. Their calls were well focused on these problems. And so there are many people that didn't think that Zapatismo would and now we have the pandemic, and we have the protection of life in each of our communities, in our homes. We are confined in lockdown, such as myself in this apartment. We are protecting life, and this is an essential activity, the protection of life, the health of everyone. We focus on what we are eating, and we are seeing how we can protect the land. So in this sense, the Zapatismo was ahead of its time. And they invite us to make political actions in different historical contexts. And they do this because to defend your life. I'm not talking about the life, the collective life, the sum of all our lives in the social life in the territory. We must create the conditions for our reproduction. And when we talk about indigenous communities that have survived centuries of attempts to destroy them in Mexico, to create these conditions for life is a truly political act, which is liberating. And this is what Alejandra was telling us. This is what Zapatismo is about. And it's of course, life has to be at the center of their work. And one of the things that I would like to underline is the role of women from different indigenous peoples in the Chiapas. Their way of participating and giving meaning to indigenous autonomy in the autonomous municipalities in the day-to-day life. And they are focusing mainly on protecting life. It's not necessarily an activity that's exclusive to women, but if one has to be protecting life and finding the plants in the forest and the mountain that can provide health, to have a garden that feeds the body well, to have knowledge of traditional medicines and also ways of preparing food from the grandmothers. This is at the center of this government, this other autonomous government, not the production, but the reproduction of possibilities of life. And I'd like to underline that when we talk about Zapatista autonomy, we think about ordering by obeying, and how it's the people that orders and the authority has to obey the people at the grassroots. There are many fundamental elements in autonomy that seem to be at the margin of these assemblies, such as the agricultural collectives, production collectives, the health promoters. And in those spaces, what is at the center is the possibility of reproducing life, collective life. And this has an impact on what autonomy is. It has influence on this and on how Zapatismo continues to insist on protecting life and ensuring that it continues. And for this, I would like to refer to an anecdote that happened on March 8th, 2018 at the International Women's Meeting. The Caracol of Morelia went to the meeting with indigenous women from different areas of the Zapatista territory, and they took care of the food, of the microphones, the sound systems, transportation of different equipment, and of organizing the discussion areas, the latrines, and everything. And when Erika welcomed the thousands of people that were there were people even from Kurdistan. And the first thing she said was, she said, "Welcome, sisters." And so here is all the logistics of where the latrines are, and so on and so forth. And she started describing all the logistics of the space. And then she started talking about the meat of the meeting, how they invited people and how they organized the meeting. And so there seemed to be like an inversion, because first you talk about why you invite people to a meeting, and then you talk about the logistics. But when Captain Erika did this, she was saying that the logistics is not the area where the political action is done and where all the exchanges and cultural activities are done, but rather an essential component of these political actions, protecting the life of everybody, is an essential role of the host beyond the discussions and the cultural activities. So I would like to end with this. And for me, it's an example, and we can see this in different spaces of daily life and in meetings of the Zapatismo, in which, so if this protection of life is at the center of political action, how Captain Erika was showing us how an authority has to be, how a government should be, another kind of government, when protecting life is at the center of everything. And even this, if this was before the pandemic, but today it's even more the case, because we have to focus on protecting ourselves. And there is an invitation to rethink the possibilities and new horizons that the pandemic are forcing us to do. But if we take in seriously what was said at the beginning of the pandemic, that the pandemic is a space of transition to another world, which could be better, in which the destruction and the production and in which we have to do a 180-degree turn. There's an invitation in these small gestures, such as those that did Captain Erika, and how we have to relate and what we have to and how to do the transition to other possibilities. So these are thoughts I want to share with you, such as the teachings that the Zapatista are offering us, and also we have to listen to them and learn from them and interact with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariana. It's been, you are perfectly on the mark, on the 15-minute mark. There's a very, very clear and compelling effort of showing what this change has meant, emphasizing on life and on women, and led by the Zapatistas. We hope that now Claudia Yadira Caballero has been able to solve her technical problems. And
well, I'm going to talk about the Zapatistas movement from my personal experience. Zapatismo has had a great influence on my generation. We grew up and were formed with the central elements of Zapatismo. This is how the search for political and economic autonomy became the goal for many groups and networks. The Zapatista movement opened a window of possibilities to think differently about social organization and even more to change the way we perceive our existence in the world. For the vast majority of Mexicans who are not indigenous and do not come from an original people, the question has always been, how does Zapatismo impel us to change and act from our own places? For 38 years, I have been living in Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world. And in the last 10 years, I have witnessed the acceleration of capital, territorial disorder, excessive debt, and increased consumption. People are spending more and more time commuting from one place to another. Overcrowding and tiredness are evident. Technology promises to entertain people with all kinds of TV shows and videos, keeping them distracted from their lives. In this condition, how can we think of autonomy or self-organization that the Zapatistas teach us? Wherever capital is concentrated, any initiative contrary to the development and consumerist paradigm is more difficult. However, emptiness are also evident. So those who have a sensitive ear and can listen, seek and find other paths. In all cities, there are many sensitive groups of different size and vocation. Some call what they do solidarity economic, the growth, self-management, cooperatives, and so on. Actually, the names do not matter too much. They can change as long as the essential alternative practices are preserved. The evidence that our planet's natural limits are incapable of sustaining this society lead us to rethink the type of civilization that we need. Mainly the people who live in city, and we have to listen to those who have known how to maintain balance with nature. The indigenous people have historically protected the 80% of the world's biodiversity. The Zapatista movement has much to contribute, questioning a model based on material progress and through an approach that merge ancestral principles and current problems. This approach recovers key position from the knowledge and know-how of ancestral peoples. The south of Mexico is undermined by mega projects, driven by mining, hydraulic, tourism, highways, energy, banking, financial, and housing corporations that are smashing the planet. To all this, we must add the exponential growth of drug industry and trade. In addition to the dispossession of the territory, we are facing extreme violence. In southern countries, both drug trafficking and femicides are social control techniques. The uncertainty of the future has never been so evident. There has been no response from the main international organization commensurate with the problem. For many scientists, the recent pandemic that humanity has gone through is caused by the deterioration of ecosystem, and the regions most affected will be the southern. It is clear that countries will have different responses and ways to adapt to this change. We are already witnessing the response of northern countries to waves of immigration, many of them responding with violence and closing the borders. Therefore, not only do we have to see the seriousness dispossession of territory, but it will imply more violence, wars for the control of territory with its common goods, an increase in racism, more authoritarian regimes, and greater digital control and surveillance. We are facing a multi-sector war. In this context, we need ways to guide us and dare to imagine another type of civilization. The Zapatistas movement continues to be a referent that speaks to youth and women movements, calling them to imagine other ways of life. We listen to the Zapatistas' call because our mixed culture, it is easy to find everywhere gestures, acts, rituals, costumes that are signs of nature-friendly cosmogony. It is a dual process. By one side, critique of Western development, while simultaneously reconnecting with our origins. Latin America has found the way forward within its own history, turned to its original inhabitants, the most humbled, the most affected, and the wisest. Latin America has not forgotten, it has recovered its memory, and Zapatista's movement is an example of that. The sense of community is deeply rooted in some indigenous people. There are even languages that do not have a word to define the self, as the Tojolabal, that is a language spoken in some village in Chiapas, Mexico. They use the pronoun we, which change the way they are perceived in the world. Identity is not based in the separation of my body from the others. Maybe a good metaphor is that each person is like a wave in the same ocean. Each wave is different with a particular temperament, size, sound, but in the end, all the waves are in the same ocean. Therefore, they have a deep empathy that we could summarize as, if I am hungry, all are hungry. We all are hungry. If you are cold, we are all cold. Those of us who were born in cities value personal of freedom as is our great right. And often we ask ourselves, what happened with individual freedom in this concept of community? How does the descent occur? Is a dictatorship of the majority? The truth is that there is still a lengthy path ahead to understand how to create caring and sustainable relations without falling into atavism. Community feminism has come a long way in this regard. For example, the Zapatistas women are changing the relationship between men and women in their own territories. They value their feminine point of view and placing care and the reproduction of life at the center. When Zapatistas women value their own practice, they introduce them into their own discourses, and they make them the center of a political struggle. Zapatistas women speak of their knowledge of herbs for healing, of their work in the cornfield, of their way of cooking, of the pain of giving a birth to a baby. They speak to many young women in the cities about these topics, and the women in the city start to create, to organize health circles, care talks, herbal manuals, and so on. Of course, one of the most important lessons that Zapatismo has shared with the groups in the city is the perspective of nature. For indigenous people, the land is a generous being that they thank for providing and for the place where they can be. It's like a caring mother. They feel a deep love for the territory where there are lake, forests, jungles, where there is the air they breathe and the animals with whom they share their lives. There is an attachment to the particular space. They identify it with its characteristic and create a way of life in accordance with it. This conception of the planet is drastically different from the one that has prevailed in Western life, where nature has been seen as something to be dominated and is studied not to gently understand it, but to take advantage of its resources. And this is not about a metaphorical knowledge or a romantic views of nature. In the circumstances in which we are, it is fundamental to stop deeming nature as a resource for the desire of growth that only benefits a very small fraction of the population. The most recent lesson given us by indigenous people and Zapatistas has been about caring in the midst of the pandemic. They denounce the inability of the government and the inability of the health system. They decide to take very precaution measures. For example, they close the caracoles and the good government meetings. And if the people who want to return to their community have to be in quarantine before entering to the community. In the city, we are far from these examples. The overcrowding and long distance accelerate the contagion. There is not enough local organization to provide for neighborhood care measures, but there are other tangible influence of the Zapatistas movement in the cities. One example is the battering group in Mexico City, of which I have been part for more than 10 years, the Multitrueque Mixiuhca. We, like many groups in the city, are trying to create an interdependent community to satisfy the needs of its members in a comprehensive manner, generating human and sustainable economic relations. For such goal, we use a community currency. We are part of a mixed culture that allows us to take the best elements of the culture that make us up and substitute the values of mercantile society, competition, speculation, and predation with values of reciprocity, sharing, and respect. We speak of untraditional ways of life in common. Models of community currency seek to create options for a life much more harmonious with nature in the cities. They look for good being, good doing, and good living. They reject a logic of competence and seek to replace violence and war with a collaborative, creative, and life-giving logic. Conventional money only finds its backing in the fear it fosters, in the weapons it builds, in the media it controls. This is why we speak and practice an autonomy system in which it is essential to appropriate the tool of exchange to create our own symbols of value, far from the language that perpetuates violence. Community as a political and economic act of intimacy can transform the way in which people in it live, feel, and think. We become conscious of the generation of a new political subject that challenge the logic of the market. Community grants a sense of commitment, identity, and dignity that it is only possible in the sensitive relationships we assume with others. Thus, the community becomes a fundamentally basic unity, one in which it's possible to create life, not individually. It is the common life, the experience of self-management, of its own capacities, resources, that we are capable of resisting and fighting for it. And we are also capable of defending our place, our territory, and our planet, as teach us by Zapatista's example.
Thank you, Claudia. And we are beginning, and we could continue and continue all day, all night. If we are talking about the Zapatistas, it's impossible to summarize what has been said. But before making some comments, I would like to thank you, to thank the comrades that brought their vision, their lucid visions and their clear voices to this session. I would also like to thank Kimchi and all the institutions and the people who made possible this session and have done a formidable effort in spite of the challenges and technical difficulties that we've had to face. But it seems to be worth it. It seems to be really worth it because Zapatistas today continue to be a source of inspiration for everybody all over the world, because Zapatistas continue to inspire us when we are facing in the world a situation that seems unbearable, because millions that are in despair, that are desperate, and millions of people who are discontent and do not know what to do, these millions find in the Zapatistas hope. We could say, what is the most important thing? But this is very difficult. I would like to say that from my point of view, the most important thing that Zapatismo has done is to face from the first moment, from the onset, what seems to be the most important struggle, which is the anti-patriarchal struggle. I want to highlight that from January 1st, 1994, with the Women's Revolutionary Law, Zapatista women had a decisive presence within the movement. And not only until today, but increasingly. And that this movement and their initiatives are turning things around, breaking and subverting the patriarchal equilibrium or balance, giving an opportunity to the struggle for life, as we have mentioned several times today during tonight. Zapatistas represent from the anti-patriarchal struggle the possibility of a different autonomous struggle, construction. And this autonomous construction, one of the first things that it does is to dissolve the hierarchies. It is important to remember something that is exceptional. An army, the Zapatista army in 2006, they say, because it is an army that has to be vertical, we will leave, we will go to the mountain. We do not want verticalism to infect the communitary way of life. This is really exceptional. This is unique, a movement of this type. And Zapatistas never wanted to be a model in the Leninist tradition. They never wanted to be the guides of the masses. They never presented themselves as the way or the form that was to be adopted. They were a source of inspiration, but they were not a leading head or a guiding head, a directing force. We remember very well in that what was called the Intergalactic Meeting, where 6,000 people from all over the world came, and many militants that were very active, and they wanted to obtain there amid the Zapatistas a new international in the Leninist tradition of socialism. And Subcomandante Subcommander Marcos, in the name of Zapatistas, had mentioned that a new international had been created, the International of Hope, not a bureaucratic apparatus, not a way of guiding everybody, but a way of joining our hands, our views around hope, a hope that was based on the capacity of listening. Commander Thatcher said this once, to listen is not only to hear the other person, but it's to be willing to be transformed by the other one. And Gilberto told us how from the first moment, those who were able to lead the indigenous were able to listen to the indigenous and to be transformed by the indigenous people. And that is how Zapatismo was born. And that is how it continues to be today. It is not going to Europe to conquer or to give back the conquest. It's going to listen. It's going to listen to that Europe from the bottom, to those hundreds of organizations that they are finding in a horizontal way. And I read in the chat tonight that we have had some comments and some questions. There are people who in India have spoken about Zapatismo in 10 states, and they want to receive Zapatistas, and you can wait for them. You can expect them, because they announced that they are not only going to Europe, they're going to Europe and to Africa and Latin America, and they're going to India for sure. They will be there for sure, because Zapatistas, in this inspiration, constant inspiration that they are giving us, they are inspiring us to link together horizontally with others, men and women who are also challenging and contesting the dominant system. People who want to build another way, another possibility of life, another hope. And we go and we listen to them and we hug each other and we link to each other and we learn ones from others, practicing solidarity. We don't turn around. We don't turn upwards, looking upwards. We turn towards ourselves. We are not interested in the power from above, because we have conquered the power below, the power that we already have, the power that we can exercise every day. And like this, hugging ourselves, hugging each other, today in the present with Zapatista inspiration, we change the world. Thank you very much, everybody, to all of you for being here in this panel today, which is more than anything, recognition, acknowledgement of what Zapatismo is giving us until today. Good morning, good evening, good night.
Felicidades, Gustavo.
Gracias.
Una excelente forma de terminar.
Muy bien, sí. Un gran abrazo a todos y a todas. Gracias, Gustavo.
Gracias.
Gracias, Gustavo. Gracias, Kinchi. Abrazos a todos, a todas.
Gracias, Gustavo.
Buenas noches.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the
Gracias,
whole team
Mariana.
that's organizing this from Mexico.
Gracias. Adiós, Kinchi.
Adiós, buen día. Buenas
Adiós.
noches.
Buenas tardes por allá. Thank you.